Thank you for joining us here today at Sapodilla Estate. We are delighted to strategically partner with the Bahamas think tank. You will hear more about it. We're delighted that so many people are tuned in via live stream as well. Sapodilla Estate is 7 acres, native trees, wetlands, exotic flora and fauna, and just a few years ago we presented our wetlands to the Bahamian people, and Mr. Eric Carey from the Bahamas National Trust was with us. We're happy to have you here today. A number of ambassadors, dignitaries who will all be introduced in short order. Our CEO, Ms. Elaine Pinder, thank you for seeing and understanding the vision, and everybody welcome. I'd like to call up at this time someone who is no stranger to the think tank, and quite frankly, a catalyst and a part of the reason why we are meeting here today. So Andy, thank you for that and for all that you do. Former ambassador to the Republic of China, Your Excellency, who will be serving as a co-moderator today. So Andy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Gandhi, and it's good to get that Sapodilla ad out of the way. And welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. And before we continue, I'd like to call Bishop Neil Ellis, who is a member of the Bahamas think tank, to the podium to bless this opening and this event with a prayer. Thank you.
Let's bow our heads and we remain seated. Oh, gracious and almighty and all-wise God, we are so very, very privileged to be placed here in the Bahamas and to be able to call it our home. We believe now that you've graced each person here today with the opportunity to enhance the environment of our country and to build the spirit of our people even as we continue to build the infrastructure of this country. We thank you for all of those who are here gathered, and we thank you for today's proceedings, and now we invite the presence of your Holy Spirit to guide us through the deliberations today. And as we do, we pray that the end result of our being together today would help to make the lives of Bahamians better. Now we ask your blessings upon the food that we shall partake of. We pray that you would bless it even in our consumption and during our digestion. And for all these things we say, amen. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop Ellis. Again, good afternoon, most distinguished guests and fellow Bahamas think tank members. Welcome to the Bahamas think tank issue paper presentation on climate change. The Bahamas think tank has been in existence since January 2020, and I have been a member since July 2020. The Bahamas think tank's visionary founder, Mr. Andy Ingram, will explain shortly the genesis of the think tank. However, a bit of general information. A think tank has been defined as a group of people whose sole profession is to read, write, research, and discuss topics that are of importance to the social good. It's a form of collective intelligence. The Bahamas think tank operates on the WhatsApp platform and is comprised of a diverse group of 246 members from both government and from civil society. Civil society has been called an essential building block of development and of national cohesion. Modern think tanks began as a phenomenon in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries, and prior to 1945, they tended to focus on the economic issues associated with industrialization and urbanization. Today's climate change issue paper is prepared by experts in the field and is presented by the Bahamas think tank Subcommittee. After today, the issue paper on climate change, in addition to questions and points raised today, will be forwarded to the general think tank membership, that is 246 members, for review and comments. Thereafter, the climate change issue paper presented today, along with the think tank's general suggestions and comments, will be forwarded to the National Development Plan Committee and presumably, eventually, to the relevant policy makers. Today's presentation is under the patronage of two esteemed members of the Bahamas think tank, Sir Franklin Wilson and Ambassador, the Honorable Sidney Colley, who is here with us this afternoon, and we thank them for their kind consideration. Distinguished guests and fellow think tank members, please welcome to the podium the Honorable Sidney Colley, former Ambassador to the United States of America, who will offer brief comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Andy, and let me recognize the Director General from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Rhoda Jackson, all of the persons at the head table, all of the members present of the think tank, as well as the special committee under whose auspices today's event is being pulled off. Ambassador Andy correctly pointed out that there's another Andy. His name is Dr. Andy Ingram. He's a Bahamian businessman who resides in Florida. He is very active in the hotel ownership and operation business. Andy came up with the idea. He called me up while I was in Washington, D.C., and says, I want to start an international Bahamian think tank. And I thought it was a good idea, being in Washington, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of not only think tanks, but all kinds of fora for sharing and expanding on ideas, academic as well as social. So Andy started the think tank. It was called the International Think Tank. I think it's had a couple of mutations since then. But as Ambassador Andy has pointed out, it has grown exponentially to almost 250 persons. Those of you who are in the chat and even on other social media platforms will know it's a lively chat. It gets hot. It has an array of diverse persons in all of the major disciplines, in medicine, in engineering, in law, in education, in academia, in government, in business. And there has been cross-fertilization of ideas over the last year, in some cases quite controversial. But that's what think tanks do. And Sir Franklin Wilson, who is the co-patron of today's event, and on whose behalf I must give his apology, he could not be here today, came up with the idea. He spoke to me about it, and the then president of the University of the Bahamas, about let's move the think tank forum from just a talk shop, and let's now start really diving deep into the issues and start to advise policymakers. And so when I saw this first committee, this is just one of many committees mobilized, I said we are actually on the road to national development with a deep dive. And so today, I congratulate the committee who is presenting the paper on climate change. You are probably going to hear such things as carbon footprint, resilience, adaptation, the SDG, the MDGs. You're going to hear things like alternative sources of energy, coastal erosion, the blue economy, the orange economy, the green economy, intergovernmental climate change, fossil fuel, global footprint, and more. We are less than 3 months away from the start of the hurricane season. So climate change is an existential threat to the Bahamas. You only have to look at the most recent cyclone, Hurricane Dorian in 2019, and see the devastation climate change has caused 2 of our major islands, but the entire nation. And so those in the diaspora who are on the stream, Bahamian citizens who are online, and residents, this is a good beginning. I understand it's a very scholarly presentation, and it is going eventually to be produced into either white paper or green paper and presented to the government and other policymakers going forward. So I thank you very much, and I congratulate all of those who have had anything to do with this venture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Colley, for contextualizing the Bahamas think tank and letting us know a bit about the history. We'd like at this time to call to the podium Ms. Rhoda Jackson, the newly minted Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ms. Jackson.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gomez. Let me say how pleased I am to be here this afternoon. I've always found the issue of climate change very interesting and very important, particularly because we're a small island developing state. I recall the early meetings that used to be held at the UN, the Program of Action for Small Island Developing States. And in 2002, I was a part of the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which gave particular attention to the issue of climate change. As a small island developing state, as Ambassador Colley just said, this for the Bahamas is very important. And I first of all want to applaud the work of this think tank, because I know that coming out of this process, we hope that we would have concrete action and not just words. I think we've talked a lot about climate change over the years. As Ambassador Colley also alluded to, the hurricane that we had in Freeport, something that was never seen anywhere else in the world, should be the calling card for us to recognize that we have to do what we can to preserve what we have. I was at a function just yesterday, and there was a comment about sea level rise and how I think there's an area in Sandyport where the sea level has actually grown by some 10 inches just because of what's happening in the climate. And even when you look at what's happening worldwide, we are a small country, but we have to do what we can to protect our own environment. So I just want to say that I want to applaud the work of the think tank. I am really looking forward to see what the outcome looks like. And I'm sure with all the expertise I see in the room with Dr. Carey, who is smiling, and Dr. Davis, I'm convinced that we have the key people who have been following these issues on climate change for years, really. And we know that they will give it their best shot. And as I said earlier, we need to move from talking to walking. And even though we may take small steps to get the job done, we need to make sure that each step counts. So I want you to continue the journey. I want you to, let's move away from the talk And even if they're small steps, let's see how we could make even the citizens of our country more versed in what they can do to mitigate the challenges of climate change. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today, and we look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jackson. And for the benefit of the attendees, Ambassador Jackson served and represented the Bahamas with distinction in Switzerland 5 years ago. Welcome back. Before we introduce the founder of the think tank, Andy Ingram, I'd like to recognize the presence of Ms. Jerusa Ali from the British High Commission. Welcome, Ms. Ali. It's good to see you again. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andy Ingram, founder of the Bahamas National Think Tank, who will be joining us virtually. Mr. Ingram. Thank you.
One moment, we're going to bring him up on the screen. At some point that's opportune or convenient for you, please feel free to go over and ensure that you get some time.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Andy, great ambassador, and great job. To keep it very formal. My bishop, Neil Ellis, I can't say enough. Thanks for all the work you've done. And there's so many people that have gotten us to where we are today. I may be the founder, but it's a result of the many people in my life and my commitment to being a hand no matter where I am. I was delighted to see Ambassador Rhoda Jackson. And I must share a funny story about her. She had just left us here in Miami, back to see her go and went to Switzerland. She had a young man that was employed with her, young Bahamian gentleman, and I was informed roughly about 4 p.m. that day that that gentleman had an unfortunate accident and was killed while installing a cable TV. And his father was on the line, and we called up Ambassador Jackson in Switzerland, which I think was about 1 a.m. in the morning. For those of you that know me, I have no idea about time around the world. And I got on the phone to inform her of the passing of this young man. And the first thing she did was said we should get the PM on the line, because the father had lost his only son. That young man was scheduled to work in my office after leaving the Consul General's office, and it was such a sad experience. But what was so great to see the ambassador, who was the former Consul General in Miami, and the Prime Minister speak to the father of this young man to express their condolence. We in the diaspora have an appreciation for people like Rhoda Jackson, and I wanted to share that because that's a story that I will never forget, that came out of a tragic, and it's great to see her back, where I think she's going to be a great contributor to the development of the Bahamas. She also said some interesting things, and one is, if you're going to complain about something, then you must be prepared to be an actioneer and do something. The think tank is a result of that. This is only the first of a number of topics that we have that we intend to cover. We have a number of individuals, and this is going to be a topic that we're moving forward at the first annual Bahamas Diaspora Summit. And that's July 13th in Miami. July 15th in Miami through the 17th, where there must be almost 200,000 Bahamian
with heritage connections, whether they're in Miami, New York, around the world, that we're going to, and I'm part of it, give the voice to how do we continue with nation building. Sir Frankie Wilson and Ambassador Sidney Colley as our patrons have been an ever so leading factor here to understand some of the issues and concerns, and I'm happy that they can help. When we looked at climate change, and we looked at some of the issues, not only from a worldwide standpoint, whether there's the environmental science of oceanography, the Bahamas is squarely in the middle of what the impact of climate change would have. We were so concerned that through the C.A. Smith Foundation, we decided to go and raise money and begin to offer scholarships to young people that are being trained around the world on climate change that can come back and help the Bahamas. When we looked at the diaspora and the think tank and the other many topics, we allocated $1 million just for agricultural scholarships. We now have 4 Bahamian students studying in Tallahassee under the dean, another Bahamian, Robert Taylor, at Florida A&M University. We've got 8 kids studying aviation. The only way to get around the Bahamas for many years was mail voting. It's now, when you have importance of time, aviation. So we look at a number of these issues that are so critical that we intend to touch. Honorary consuls that we brought on board, and I can't say enough about Bill Picard, who gave us the first $1 million to allocate to help Agro when during the hurricane that destroyed both Freeport and Abaco. Sitting in my living room in the comfort of being located in Florida, I wanted to know what could I do. And I began immediately mobilizing folks. I called the owner of Tropic Ocean Airline, Rob Chavello, and I said, Rob, how many airplanes do you have that you can dedicate to flying goods and services and people into the devastated area? I called on many of my diaspora members, Rosie Gomez from the Bahamian Association, and we began to raise money because we didn't want to complain. We didn't want to just do nothing. We wanted to be actioners. That's what the think tank is all about. How do we help in nation building? And I must tell you that one of the first issues we ran into, and I fear when the ambassador talked about the hurricane coming again, we discovered that we could not get goods and services in the Freeport or Abaco because of all the infrastructure that was destroyed. I immediately made a call to the government officials and I said, we've got to open up the Bahamas. And they said, no, Mr. Ingram, every bit of supplies that you're bringing in should be sent to Nassau. They should then be inspected, and then shipped to the various destinations. Well, all of you know what an issue that would have created. I then said to them, why not move the customs and immigration officers to Miami or Fort Lauderdale? And they said, for the moment, great idea, who will pay for it? And I said, the diaspora. And for 18 months, we ran goods and services with immigration officers in Fort Lauderdale, inspecting every piece of equipment and persons that departed. There was never any issue that we would not do the job that they would have done in the various posts in the Bahamas. That gave us another idea. And what could we do? How do we open up the Bahamas? But when we talk about climate change, and we talk about sea level rising, and we talk about the Bahamas, remember the 700 islands that we have are all encompassed by water. And so we're going to be impacted. And today, you'll hear from the experts in that area. It's only the beginning on what we can do, what we should do, and how we should face these problems head on. I'm an individual that I'm never going to shy away from a problem. I'm never going to shy away from being a Bahamian. I'm never going to shy away about helping when I can. Part of what the think tank does, part of my regular job as a hotel developer, where back in 2001, when there were no people of color in the United States owning hotels, we grew the franchise from one hotel in 2001 to just over 2,000 hotels in the United States owned by people of color. And the young Bahamian woman is married to one of my board members who owns the largest hotel in Washington, D.C., an 1,175-room Marriott. I'm happy to report that last Friday, sitting in the office, one of our developers, informed by the General Service Administration, that we were approved to buy a Trump Hotel in D.C. that will now, the name be taken off as the Trump Hotel and will become one of the best hotels in the nation and in Washington, D.C., the Waldorf. I say all of that to say that the commitment of people and that support me, whether it's my daughter PJ, who is our technical person, that it goes wide and deep. People that want to help the Bahamas for no other reason that it's the right thing to do. I can't say enough about Rob Favello or Yellow Cab or Royal Caribbean. All the folks have contributed, helping us build the Bahamas, either through our scholarship programs or through just the contribution that during the hurricane. And Ambassador Colley was in D.C. He spent countless hours on the phone with me, with other government officials. When we wanted to ship goods, I think we were shipping at the average of 10 containers a week. Seacorp, tropical shipping, all who agreed to take containers in for us at no cost. So it is coming together. And for the think tank, and Andy Gomez said it best when he joined, what is it that we're going to do? Well, today, you're going to see. You're going to hear from my cousin, Eric Carey, and his folks, Carlos Palacios, on what is it that we need to do about climate change. We've made the commitment. We've not only made the commitment in words, we're prepared to make the commitment financially, educationally, and more importantly, to educate young people who are our next generation of leaders. A young lady sent us a note the other day, Mrs. Thea Parkinson, and she thanked us for the funding that we provided her. Today, she's spending time in Europe working for an agency as a project manager, getting more training for when she returned to the Bahamas to help. Today is only the beginning, and we're so delighted that all of you can join us. Excited about the presentation, and I hope you will join with me in sitting down, listening, taking notes, and becoming an actionnaire. Our think tank may have only 257 members or 46 members, but quite frankly, all of us are responsible for helping to build a nation. Our goal is to help change where we're going, develop succession plans, help government officials, private sector, but more important, help young people that can bring us to where we need to go. As a young man, when I first came home, there was a gentleman called C.A. Smith that took me by the hand and gave me the sort of guidance that I use today, along with the guidance I got from my parents. I'm eternally grateful to all of them. I'm grateful to my current group of friends, my colleagues, my investors, my kids, and of course, my family and my wife. Hopefully, we will make a difference. I'm committed to join and make that difference in nation building. Thank you for the time, and thank you all for attending this important discussion on nation building and climate change. Good afternoon. Mr. Gomez, back to you. Ambassador Gomez, back to you.
Thank you, Andy, for that 30-second presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, this presentation, luncheon today, is being sponsored or brought to you by the Subcommittee of the National Think Tank. And at this time, I'd like to introduce the co-chairs of the subcommittee, the committee responsible for putting this function together. Please help me welcome to the podium Mr. Jeffrey Beckles, who will be joined later by his co-chair, Mr. Felix Stokes. Mr. Jeffrey Beckles.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon. One of the initial significant steps that this think tank took was to see the need to break our groups into subgroups. While we appreciate the opportunity to engage in broad-based discussions about relevant issues that face our country, we thought that it would be almost unproductive to continue a conversation with 267 people. And so I got with both Andy's and Felix, and we decided to take a look at how we could make this think tank more productive. And one of the ways to do that was simply to break it down into working groups, which we did. Today is a first fruit of that decision as we look at issues and tackle issues that face our country in a very rapidly changing global environment. We now realize that the context of our discussions must be broadened and deepened to where we have real thought, supported by real research, where our ideas can be fleshed out into white or green papers that can ultimately be transformed into reasonable public policy that will allow the Bahamas to grow and participate in a global environment. But further to that, we also wanted to deepen opportunities for the average Bahamian to get involved and to participate. And that's been a cry for Bahamians for decades. How can I participate? And that was part of the reason why we decided to break our groups into working groups. And today, it is a real honor for us to have the first of our presentations being done, which will be done on climate change, an issue that affects every single Bahamian, and one that every Bahamian should take pride in owning a part of that discussion. And so the idea of this exercise is literally to demonstrate the importance of two words that we have run from for decades: collaboration and cooperation. And when we embrace those two ideals, partisanship gets pushed to the side. If we agree then that we have one Bahamas to build and one Bahamas to sustain, then these two values are values that we must embrace. And so I welcome the idea and the concepts of being able to break our groups into smaller working groups, to be able to produce papers that can ultimately be presented to our policymakers for the benefit of our Bahama land. And so we thank you again for your initial presence and support for our efforts. And I welcome to the podium my co-host colleague, Felix Stokes.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good afternoon. I'm going to stand on a protocol that's already been established and go straight into my 3-minute presentation. I wrote my remarks so that I don't be more than 3 minutes, Jeff. But I want to take you back to April 11th, 2016. It was one day before my birthday, and I had the opportunity to present to the nation the state of the nation as seen through the eyes of the National Development Plan. We call it the State of the Nation. And then I said, and I quote, "The Bahamas is naturally beautiful, but has high vulnerabilities. Our natural assets has to be carefully protected and managed. Climate change is a core threat to the future of our beloved country. We are under siege from the rising temperatures and rising sea levels. In Family Island after Family Island, residents took us to places now covered in water where land once stood. Adaptation is critical to preventing a crisis. The issue of climate change is a serious one. Indeed, a sea level rise of 1 meter would eliminate 80% of the landmass of this country. Look, too, at the most losses incurred from hurricane impact. Hurricane Sandy had a total economic cost of $702.8 million, approximately 9% of the GDP at the time. Walk-in is estimated at 100 million. We have to be prepared as a nation for these changes. In addition to the threats from climate change, the Bahamas ranks amongst the most water-scarce of small island developing states. There are significant threats to the coastal and marine environment, including a heightened vulnerability to storm surge and sea level rise due to direct impacts from such things as dredging, removal of mangroves, landfilling, and indirect impacts such as insecticides and severe discharge and runoff. I also spoke about some landfill, but I'm going to skip that in the interest of time and say, as I said then, the government has acknowledged the importance of these issues, and there has been some recent national initiatives. Most critical, however, there's also a need for the issue of climate change and environmental degradation to reach the average Bahamian. I think it is safe to say that we have done very little to move the needle along that proposed 25-year development plan in the past 6 years. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Andy Ingram for starting the Bahamas think tank chat group. A thank you also goes to my co-host Jeff Beckles, whose idea it was to create these subgroups to focus on specific issues arising from within that group. And a very special thank you to former Ambassador Andy Gomez, who's been the driving force to get us to this point today. I look forward to the presentations and the eventual outcomes with the hope that we can set out on a path to address these issues identified in the National Development Plan over 6 years ago. Because we need to do all that we can, not only to just say we're addressing climate change, but to make sure we help save our country for our future generations. I thank you for your support. I look forward to the afternoon's presentation.
Thank you very much, Felix. And now to that point of the challenge where we have been challenged to walk the walk and do less talking. In the Bahamas, we often talk about the extraordinary talent and giftedness we have in the Bahamas. Well, today we are happy to say that we are embracing that talent and those giftedness in the persons of Eric Carey and Carlos Palacios, who will now come and introduce our presentation for today. These are celebrated young Bahamians, and I believe the time has come for us to begin to not talk about the talent we have, but to begin to celebrate and showcase. And what I mean by celebrate, where we challenge them to do the research and to develop those ideas and bring those ideas to the table. And today we have three, and they will introduce the third one. We have two very proud sons of the Bahamian soil that I will welcome to the podium now in the persons of Eric Carey and Carlos Palacios, who will introduce our presentation for this afternoon. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Good afternoon, everyone. It is our pleasure to be here with, obviously, protocol and background information already being established. This today is several weeks of work and several decades of knowledge, growth, and understanding as a Bahamian people who have been able to access some of the brightest minds, not only in our nation, but in the region on the areas of climate change. Of course, between Braun and the Bahamas National Trust, we represent, by standing at the podium, a strategic partnership that shows what happens when the private sector, non-governmental agencies are able to come together through the various backgrounds and the various levels of expertise that we have to put a step forward in our national development. We all would consider ourselves doers. Eric, of course, coming from Eleuthera, my family coming from Managua, having touched the beaches, having seen the impacts of our hurricanes, understanding what our future looks like if we don't take action immediately, decisively, and impactfully. So we look forward to the opportunity to share what we found. We remain available through our organizations and through our life's purpose to continue to contribute to building this nation. And we know that together we can definitely tackle this threat, and we can do it in a meaningful way that will ensure that our future generations will enjoy the blessings that we've grown up to sometimes take for granted. So I thank you so much, and Eric, please take the podium.
Thank you. Excellencies, Excellency Rhoda, it's so good to see you back where you belong. Good, Andy, a good government high graduate. We won't start the SAC government high debate today. My good cousin Andy, with Andy Ingram, his vision to start this. I think the fact that the first of these presentations centers on the environment speaks of how important the environment is to our country. It is everything. It is our stock in trade. The extent to which we understand and protect our environment is the extent to which our country is going to be successful. It is also very powerful that one of the most astute businessmen in this country, who just spoke, Felix, spoke as a true environmentalist, understanding that whatever he's done throughout his very distinguished career, that is important for people like him to speak about national development and the environment. So for us, it is a great pleasure to be here. This is something we must take very seriously. And I believe that in this group, in this think tank that Andy has put together, are the brightest minds, the sharpest minds, the thinkers, but more importantly, I think Andy has put together, like he himself described, doers who will look at these issues, come up with solutions, and encourage these decision makers, whether the government, public, private sector, all levels of our society, to go out and get the job done. And so with that, I would like to introduce our colleague, Dr. Ancelino Davis, and to apologize for our other colleague, Kelly Armstrong. Dr. Davis and Kelly works with Braun. Dr. Davis works with the Bahamas National Trust. They are two brilliant young Bahamians, and as Carlos alluded to, he works in one sector, I work in the other, but we have collectively provided more than 100 jobs for young Bahamians in the field of the environment, and that's something that we are very proud of. And Kelly and Dr. Davis represent I won't say the cream of the crop because I don't want to get anybody upset, but certainly represent the brilliance that exists in our country. And you will hear Leno present what he and Kelly came up with. And I would like at this time to simply invite Dr. Leno Davis, Ancelino Davis, to make our presentation.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Mr. Carey. And thank you everyone for being here today. I stand on the protocol that has already been established, but I would also like to take this moment to welcome everyone that's watching online and all the Bahamians who have a vested interest in your own survival, really. Today, I will be presenting the Climate Change Priorities Memo. For those of you that don't know me, I am Dr. Ancelino Davis. I'm the Senior Scientist and Policy Analyst at the Bahamas National Trust. I founded Bahamians Educated in Natural and Geospatial Sciences. I sit currently as the Chair of the Technical Committee on Environmental Protection and Management and on the Environmental Health Board for the Bahamas. I formerly sat on the Sustainable Development Goals Committee, National Biodiversity Subcommittee, and helped to map the impact of Hurricane Dorian on the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Kelly Armstrong, who works with Braun and contributed significantly to this work as well, is not only a young Bahamian as well, but she is the first Bahamian climate change professional certified by the Association of Climate Change Officers. And she founded the environmental team at Braun. And even during her graduate work, she focused on Caribbean climate risk management, and particularly forecast-based disaster preparedness. And she is one of the founding members of Bahamians Educated in Natural and Geospatial Sciences. And she used to work for BNT. Could we have the next slide, please? So this was our process to get to the presentation that you will be seeing today. We used the National Development Plan and the State of the Environment report, which were mentioned earlier, and we developed research priorities from those. Kelly conducted key expert interviews, and those included experts like Dr. Adele Thomas, who is a climate change expert in her own right, and she focuses on the adaptation for the survival of social communities after hurricane or climate-related disasters. Shanique Albury-Smith, who until recently was the leader for the Nature Conservancy here in the Bahamas program, and she's now moved up to the Caribbean region, I think, as well as climate change and meteorology professionals in the Bahamas. Next, my responsibility was to weed through thousands of pages of scientific reports, white papers, gray papers, and different actions and policies that have been made not only in the Bahamas or in the Caribbean, but around the world related to climate change and how those priorities are outlined for the communities that are affected. And today, we're making the stakeholder presentation, where we're sharing this information with you, our esteemed colleagues that are in this room, the think tank, as well as the Bahamian people. Next slide, please. Within the National Development Plan, there's actually a very succinct, logical framework. If you have the resources, you can commit to creating actions. If you create those actions produce outputs, and those outputs, they can, once they are produced, they can produce outcomes, and those outcomes will help us to achieve our goals. Today, can we go to the next slide, please? The goals of the National Development Plan were actually separated into 4 categories that we use to develop this presentation today, so that we can continue to align with that document and support the work that has already been going on and not to reinvent the wheel. Those categories are governance, human capital, environment, and economy. When you think of governance goals, those include having a modern, open, and accountable service-oriented government, well-governed public institutions, respect for the rule of law, and appropriate administration of justice. Human capital goals include a modern healthcare system, improvement of the educational system, and access to education, alleviation of poverty, and elimination of discrimination. Environmental goals include land administration, modern physical and digital infrastructure, interconnected transport systems, and sustainable management of the natural environment. Finally, the economic goals include a healthy macroeconomy, a competitive business environment, diversified economies, support for agribusiness, improved support for cultural and creative industries, and a fair and flexible labor regime. And that comes directly from our National Development Plan. Next slide, please. Now, what follows are our summarized short-term recommendations. And these were determined to be feasible within the next 3 to 5 years with support from the government. Next slide, please. Under governance, firstly, we need legislative cohesion. And that's needed so that we can eliminate conflicts in laws and bottlenecks that actually prevent effective collaboration. And throughout our interviews and our research, that seemed to be a major issue. Our experts determined the need to develop a working group that includes the government, the University of the Bahamas National Trust, and the private sector, so that we can determine climate change research goals and give those communities mandates that free them from legal restrictions to conducting necessary work. So unbind our hands. Local governments also need to be empowered to independently respond to disasters and eliminate leadership conflicts. They need to be able to directly access support and develop community-specific action plans in the event of disasters or climate change impacts. Community-based plans need to be aligned with the national framework, and we would like to see a sister island network developed. A sister island network would allow neighboring islands to support each other in recovery when they are impacted. We saw that with Abaco being supported by Eleuthera after Hurricane Dorian, but Grand Bahama in particular didn't have a lot of support because Abaco was impacted at that time. And we expect for New Providence to be assisted by all the family islands, but are we empowering them now so that they can help us in the future? Next slide, please. There's a further need to improve the ease of doing business with the Bahamas National Geographic Information System Center. This includes us sharing geospatial information with them and retrieving information from them so that we can know where our resources are and where we need them in the event of climate impacts. Policy interventions are needed to designate local organizations that can support the national data inventory and retrieval or analysis and broaden stakeholder engagement with climate change and related issues. We need a formal comparison between our National Emergency Management Agency and the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency so that we can close the gaps between our national standards and regional standards. And also, when we need to interact with them for support, we want to make that as easy as possible. And like the National Development Plan, we need more bipartisan commitments to climate change. Pardon me. With these bipartisan commitments to climate change, we should be able to create appropriately scaled policy and physical interventions to agree on climate goals and eliminate politics from an issue that affects all Bahamians. Next slide, please. Moving on to human capital needs. These primarily surround the education and training of Bahamians. Broadly, we recommend a national climate change awareness program to let Bahamian community members know of our shared vulnerabilities. In particular, the multi-sectoral impacts of climate change must be considered, especially across government ministries such as tourism, education, and social services, to prepare for medium-term governance intervention. The Bahamas needs a trained cohort of disaster management and greenhouse gas inventory professionals to prepare us for assessments of impacts and to guide interventions using the best global standards adapted by Bahamians for Bahamian climate realities. The current standards that are global standards, they don't take into account our reality. And currently, we rely on external experts to do these assessments for us, and we feel that is inappropriate. Next slide, please. In the environmental area, the National Climate Change Awareness Program mentioned before should be Bahamas specific and based on locally collected information as well. So not just using the information from other small island developing states or around the Caribbean, but actually collecting our own information in places like the Bahamas National Trust parks, which are managed here locally by our professionals. A hazard and evacuation logistics mapping task force should be assembled to gather and compile data from other groups so that responses to national climate disasters are more efficient. We need to know where our clinics are, where our docks are, where our oil emergency responses resources are. We need to mandate the delivery of raw environmental data on natural resources within environmental impact assessments. The professionals that conduct environmental impact assessments now, they give us a summary of what they think is important. We should have that raw data so that we can use it not just for assessing their environmental impact assessment, but for broader assessment of our current state and what we need for the future. We also need considerable work to determine the feasibility of large-scale green and gray infrastructure projects. And those projects need to be assessed to support the national implementation of the Integrated Coastal Zone Management body of work. And that's been around for a long time, but it's not been fully implemented. And that's what our professionals are really seeking to have come about. Next slide, please. Environmental responses to climate change also require the removal of funding barriers to climate change research in the Bahamas, and we need to directly fund our own research where possible. Climate change and disaster funding should also be removed from the consolidated fund. This would allow us to tag it for climate-specific uses and reduce the perception of corruption. Risk maps for communities and economic centers throughout the nation should be developed and used to create resettlement or reestablishment plans for those communities. Right now, we have communities that have not been reestablished after Hurricane Dorian. Some of those people will never come back home. We need to make some priorities to focusing on that. Next slide, please. With the when those communities were destroyed and people lost their houses and some people got hit by hurricanes twice or 3 times, and they say they have enough. So now a lot of our professionals who have that ability, people who are more affluent, the communities like Treasure Key and Abaco, even some people from the Marsh Harbor area, they're not coming back, and a lot of them not only left that island, but they left our country. And so we're gonna have a continuance of that, where the poorest of the poor, they don't have a choice, but those who are able to do more or for themselves, they will leave if they can.
So what do you suggest? I'm sorry. What are you suggesting and how much?
We need to have, so with our work, we suggested that there are maps of which communities are vulnerable firstly, so that we know X community is likely to be flooded the next time there's a major impact. X community is likely to lose electricity for 18 months. So these are the communities that will be less likely to continue thriving and surviving. And so when we know where those communities are, we should also have a plan to say, if your community is impacted, this is the next nearest community that you can find support from. And or if this community is impacted, and especially when it's a major economic center, how do we get them back up and running as fast as possible? How do we make sure that communication is reestablished? How do we make sure that electricity is reestablished, et cetera? Okay. You're welcome. So finally, there are some recommendations and some evaluations that we discovered that we were not able to cleanly package them into the categories that were in the National Development Plan. And two of those major items need to be completed immediately to support the other goals. First, a firm commitment of government to infrastructure, including building space, server space, computing, storage, and redundancies should be made specifically to support climate change and disaster response work. So saying that, yes, we're going to do it, but there's no place to do it, there's no personnel to support it, that's not a useful commitment. We need a firm commitment on those things. And secondly, let's engage with the nonprofit and private sector to get commitments from them to support climate change and disaster response and to provide actions to support those responses. But these commitments must be met with similar commitments from the government to acknowledge those partnerships. So ask BNT for support in mapping the disaster impact. Ask Ron for support in mapping the infrastructure impact. But then commit as a government to acknowledging their contribution. The government should commit to also providing resources such as the geospatial information from Bahamas National Geographic Information System Center, fisheries information, social impact information, so that they can do that work. And then let the people know. And with that, I would, next slide please. I thank you for listening to this presentation, and I welcome any questions. And our contact information is here. If you'd like to reach me for further comment, it's adavis@bnt.bs, or you can reach our science program at science@bnt.bs. And Kelly Armstrong is karmstrong@bbron.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. We couldn't ask for more relevant, timely presentation on climate change because climate change was actually affecting him while he was speaking. You didn't get that. The air was too dry for him, and so he needed water. So you couldn't ask for a more real-time presentation, so well done. We do have a few minutes for question and answers, and so, in fact, three of our subject matter experts will make themselves available. We've already had two questions, very good questions asked about it. And the idea is, the question you asked, Bishop Ellis, is a very practical, very real, two real questions that are affecting Bahamians today. While we may not have resided in Grand Bahama or Abaco, for instance, it is projected that more than 72,000 Bahamians were impacted by Hurricane Dorian. Now think about that. All of us didn't live there, but were impacted by it. The people in Anagua and in the southeastern Bahamas who are still not in their homes or not in their settlements that they were in prior to their hurricane experience is still a real challenge. And so even as we think about risk mitigation, we can't just look forward. We have to look at our past experiences that are still pending, waiting solutions, and we have to make ourselves available to take those areas into consideration too, because they need answers. Because we can't have a successful, thriving country with an unhealthy state of affairs among the people who live here. And that unhealthy does not only apply to their medical health, but their holistic health. And being in their home is one of those areas that's very important for us. Yes, Ambassador?
I'd like to ask Dr. Davis a question.
Yes,
sir. Dr. Davis, is there a national networking, either linear or complex systems in preparation for the next onset of weather emergencies. You mentioned a number of different groups. In Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, certain organizations in the United States went there and put together a linear as well as a complex mapping system to include all of the various groups so that when disaster strikes, all of the different groups are into a national mapping system so that NEMA and SEDEMA and all of the Office of the Prime Minister would be locked into that system ahead of time so that there will be no scrambling around when action is needed. Has anything started in that direction?
So this is one of the tragedies that we actually found in our research. On the ground, what has happened traditionally in the Bahamas, and it's part of the beauty of our culture, we're so connected that on the one hand, no matter what island is affected or which person is affected, they're related to you. That's your cousin or your auntie, brother, or whatever, right? But at the same time, it gives us this power to reach out and to help each other fairly quickly. On the island of Abaco and on Grand Bahama, they did very well with that. And there were a lot of different people who were connected to the Red Cross, Hope, different water organizations. A lot of relief organizations came in and helped out. And there were Bahamians who were qualified in leadership to help on those islands. A lot of those little grassroots organization efforts, they persist even now. However, we did not find any formal documentation of a network system in the Bahamas or a network system that's connected to the Caribbean region that would allow us to speed up the activation of those systems in the future. And a lot of the difficulties that we pointed out were with some of the logistics of getting that support to those islands. And we're all familiar with the issues with support having to come through Nassau to go to Abaco, not knowing where the docks were and if they were still stable or able to accept support in Abaco, communications going down. A lot of that stuff we could, and it should be very easy to develop such a network, but it is not currently available.
Pastor Sabala? I just wanted to make a commendation in that at the beginning of the presentation, the doctor connected what he was presenting with what was already established. And my grandfather from Landrill, Point Crooked Island, always said the greatest room in the world is a room for improvement. And so when he referenced the National Development Plan and them working out of that, I thought that was significant to be embraced.
Thank you, and I think that was part of what Kelly and I were going for, was that we didn't want to start from scratch and bring out something that was so foreign or that anyone would feel like, oh, you're trying to bring something new to say that what we did before was not good. Because that was really valuable information, and I think it's 571 pages. And every part of it had something good to offer. But climate change is climate change. So it does develop over time, and we do need to adapt it. The National Development Plan that we were using, that draft was from 2016. And in those 5 years, this was a long 5 years, right? And so we think about that, and also when we think about our Bahamian culture, when we think about survival, we're not just thinking about us, like you said, not just living to the next year, but we want Bahamians to survive, and that means we want our crab culture on Andros to be able to survive. And with 3 foot of water and sea level rise, crabs won't reproduce. You won't be going crabbing on Andros, right? With the yeah, and right, that's a loss of our culture. And Bahamians also, after COVID inset, I was in Adelaide and I watched every day Bahamian fathers who were stuck at home with their kids for the first time, but they were teaching their kids how to fish in Adelaide Creek. And they were going out catching crabs in the Adelaide area. So if we have climate change impacts, or God forbid, an oil spill in some of these islands, you can't eat oily crabs, right? Right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I want to say thank you everyone for amazing presentations, and the moderators, everybody who spoke today in general was phenomenal. I have a direct question, and then I have a question that I'd like each of you to answer like pretty quickly. To Carlos, who's a coastal engineer. The receding, I guess, shorelines at the beaches. That's always been a concern of mine, and I wanted you to speak to that. And then generally, gentlemen, what can we do? Because we hear about the bigger picture, and we hear about these partnerships and the funding that's needed. What can we do as Bahamians, as ordinary citizens, every day to help? I know some time ago there was a goal to plant a certain amount of trees. What are practical things like that that we can do?
Great questions. Thank you so much, Gandhi. I'll start with your second question first. When asked questions along that line, I always respond by saying, you are the first responder in your own life. You are the first responder in your own life. What does that mean? Knowing how to swim could save your life when floodwaters come. Knowing that the door of your house should swing outward rather than inward could save your life, your family's life, etc. When somebody tells you that you have hurricane impact windows, if you simply ask, what hurricane am I rated for? That could save your life. We ask questions in areas of our lives that are important. When we stand up to come through customs and they tell us our bill is this, we'll ask a lot of questions. When it's time for us to go down and negotiate with the fish man or the crab man, we'll ask a lot of questions. When we go to the doctor and he tells us this, so I'm going to cut your arm off, we ask a lot of questions. We ask to get a second opinion. Do we ask those critical questions when it comes to the protection of our lives as it relates to climate change impacts and hurricanes? If you live in the Bahamas, you will be in a hurricane in your lifetime. If you live in the Bahamas, your kids and future generations, the success of their quality of life will hands down be significantly impacted by the decisions you make today. So how do we become better first responders, learning the critical things as simple as your hurricane supplies in your house? Why are they in a cupboard? If you need to leave your house because your roof blows off, you have a matter of seconds to minutes to get your entire family out. Your hurricane supplies are in a cupboard. Is that the time when you go and grab them and get a backpack? No. We prepare for what we want. We prepare for Junkanoo. We prepare for back to school. We prepare for Easter. We prepare for anything that we want. Are we preparing ourselves, taking on the individual and personal responsibility to be prepared for what we're facing in climate change? That is the challenge that I put back to everyone. As it relates to the coastal erosion, we see the transformation that we're having. The data is there. We know that sea levels are rising. We know that the water the temperatures are increasing. We know the intensity of the storms. We don't need science. We didn't need professionals to stand up here to tell you that. You know it. So how are we going to adapt as it relates to our own personal lives and the national direction that we go as it relates to our sea levels that are increasing, our water tables that are coming up, our salt, the salt that's contaminating our freshwater environments? And the key to that is understanding that data drives decision making. The National Trust and Braun, we have thousands of papers that have clearly documented what is happening in our country. The challenge and the question is then, how are we taking it on personally in our lives? If we know that when it's time to go and buy a piece of property and we just show up and the yard is flooded, are we asking the right questions before we choose to try to just put some fill and build that house down? When it's time for us to determine, okay, a hospital or an airport was destroyed by flood waters in a storm, are we taking the time needed and do we have the discipline to rebuild it in a place that's more sustainable? The answers are not rocket science. We can do it, but we have to be intentional, we have to be deliberate, and we have to each do our part and hold our own accountability in the process. I hope that answered your question.
I think we need to have an education campaign so that Bahamians can hear exactly what you just shared, because that's very important when purchasing a home and doing all of those things. That's maybe one thing, the think tank, we could push as well, too.
That's exactly my answer to your question, Gandhi. He said you would know how to swim, or you would know these different things. And for me, the first thing that any Bahamian can do is educate yourself.
Right.
Right now, we have a lot of people making noise in the market, but the information that they're bringing is inaccurate, or it's unfounded, or they're using numbers in ways that they shouldn't. Right now, any Bahamian can go online and look at the NOAA Hurricane Tracker, and you can see exactly how many hurricanes have passed through this country over the past 100 years. And you will recognize that every 10 years, we're gonna get something hit us pretty hard. And over this last 10 years, we got quite a few more than the 100-year average.
When we sign up for the National Trust, we'll get this information and you disseminate this type of information.
Yes, please do join the Bahamas National Trust.
And Braun has information right there too. We'll get it.
Okay,
Hey, just a quick.
Gentleman back and then we'll come to the left.
I heard someone mention that the Bahamas is one of the smallest countries and we need to do our part. But I bet if you were to go to the moon and if you were to look down, the greenhouse gases in the Bahamas would be one of the highest per capita in the world. Just about everyone has a car over here. The government's policy on solar panels and electric vehicles may not be as aggressive as possible. Just the other day I saw there's a construction of, I think, government homes in the southern area. And the government is not preparing for the future by giving homeowners who cannot afford solar systems, maybe house packages that include solar systems. So I think we have to lead by example. And what is your organization doing to kind of lobby to government to enact that real change so that we can have a mindset of a green Bahamas?
And so there are a few different things that are going on here. Firstly, a Bahamian individual, a lot of times, unfortunately, we're in a position of day-to-day survival, and especially after we're impacted by climate change, it's difficult to make those active decisions not to go and overfish in an area that's nearby you. It's difficult to make that decision not to chop down a tree for firewood or to build a home where you are. It's difficult to make those decisions when you're already in a climate disaster. So part of it is us making those decisions before we get to that point. And the Bahamas National Trust is actually mandated and supported by the government, where we do have a seat at the table to provide advice, but also this think tank is filled with representatives from all sectors that have those powers to call up some important people and, you know, give nudges and whisper in ears and speak loudly in some rooms. And I challenge you as well, when you see your neighbor at the barbecue throwing something in the bush, when you see your neighbor driving around in his super fast sports car and wasting gas, speak to them. Tell them about what climate change is. When you know that there's an impact, how comfortable are you? How comfortable are you speaking to your pastor or your minister about how many cars they have, how big their cars are? How many of us in the think tank are thinking about that right now, and how many of us in this room feel guilty about our recent choices? I totally agree with you. As Bahamians, we may be the first victims of climate change, but sometimes we are victimizing ourselves. But like Carla said, first aid is first person first, right? You have to think about yourself first and enact change in your life before you can influence others.
Okay, I think we have one last question here from Lester.
Yeah, we've been looking at this hurricane thing for a while now. Wayne Neely was saying that we normally have a hit at a major economic center in this country every 3 to 4 years. I'm curious, from your research, are you making any recommendations as to how we should budget for this thing? So Felix said during one hurricane we lost about 9% of GDP. I think during COVID we lost about 15% of GDP. So you guys have a feel for what percentage of GDP we should be like saving up or setting aside for these potential catastrophic events?
One of the recommendations was that we make a stronger macroeconomy and make it flexible and adaptive. One of the biggest problems that we have in the Bahamas is this idea that we want everything in Nassau or Grand Bahama or Northern Abaco. And when we look at what happened during Hurricane Dorian, when that one power plant was impacted, even if your settlement down in Southern Abaco did not get hit by that hurricane, you didn't have electricity for 6 months. We need to distribute our economic, legislative, administrative, and all of these different sectors of our society so that we would be able to be independently and autonomously powerful on each island or in each settlement, and then we would all become stronger. When you look at a forest, it's a bunch of trees that are independently strong, and that whole forest is stronger for it. But that's the major problem that we have right now.
And well said, Lino. And I'll add some aspects of it as well. Like, for example, we collect something called an environmental levy. You've probably seen it on a bill if you brought in a battery, etc. Is that money actually allocated toward the environment? It's a question. We do have some regionally acceptable standards and laws as it relates to, we just put in place mandatory evacuations. We have zoning and setback requirements. We have other areas where we try to establish no build or at least restrictive areas. But how much are we circumventing our own rules, both at the individual level, at the planning level, and at the government level? So I'd like us to challenge ourselves so that we are real with ourselves, so that when we get the results that we don't like, we're not surprised. Another point that I'll make before closing is that when you look at the ability to respond in a natural disaster, because that's what we're talking about, your community is your strongest response mechanism. The Defense Force, the Coast Guard, etc., they typically have to come after the all clear. The first people on the ground are the people in your community, the persons who have the pickup trucks, the backhoes, the excavators, etc. Community level training on how to save lives, how to simply protect your own equipment, how to, for example, build your generator so that if your entire house floods or if anything else around you floods, at least your generator was high enough to stay operative. Those types of very small lessons, ingraining them in our society, even for a future generation, can save us for several centuries. Very small lessons, very small steps, doesn't even cost much money to do community level training, and that can help us in a long way for these responses. Hope that helps. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. And to the earlier point, tying it back to the National Development Plan, climate change affects our economy, it affects our human capital, and it affects the policy decisions that we need to make. Which means this: there is no room for hiding for any Bahamian, because there's room for every Bahamian to get involved in this discussion about solutions, down to the very practical things that you mentioned, inclusive of stop going to the beach and leaving all your garbage, right? inclusive of dumping refrigerators and stoves on the highway when nobody's looking. These are very practical things that can work in community involvement at the community level. So the point is, there's no room for any Bahamian to claim that they are being excluded from the larger conversation. There is room to be included, and we want to accept the challenge today. Let's be more personally responsible. And I leave you with this question. What has changed in your life, in your household, since the last hurricane season? You think about that. Think about that for a minute. And then last thing I want to say is, if you are unfamiliar with what the work that is being done with the geospatial grouping, let me tell you, it is one of the most fascinating experiences you will ever have. If you haven't gone and inquired, please go. Because what this also does, it opens up opportunity for further education. You will get to learn things that you never thought that you would have to come face to face with. This is what the think tank is all about. Exposure, research, development, bringing those conversations to real life so that we can provide practical solutions for this country, not just to survive, but to be able to thrive. And with that, I invite my colleague Andy back with his closing remarks.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Eric, no closing comments?
Thank you.
This is a fascinating discussion. As an accountant, I don't know anything about what is being discussed, but it is a learning experience. And I think some type of PSA, public service announcement, ought to be put together, either coming out of the think tank or generally on some of the points about saving your own life. You know, that's the most important lesson. What do you do in the community to save your own life? And what needs to be done, not at a sophisticated level, but at a basic level. You know, protecting how the door swings in and out to get out of the house if there's a flood. But someone mentioned it about the makeup of the think tank. The makeup of the think tank, when I first joined the think tank, I recognized right away that it has some very significant individuals. As Bahamians, we have to move to protect ourselves, to plan for the future, and also to give Bahamians the opportunity in the Bahamas to fail if they want to fail, or to succeed if they want to succeed. So the think tank is well poised with some of the highest level advisors in this country to the policymakers. And so what we need to do, as we look around the room, we are really thankful for everyone who is here. But online, there are a number of our colleagues in the think tank who are watching. They ought to be here. But I couldn't think, Chair Jeffrey and Chair Felix, of a better subject matter to start this whole discussion off with the subcommittee. I mean, this is an ideal and a fantastic topic to really get the ball rolling to determine if we can make a difference as a collective body. So, Chairman of the National Development Plan. 6 years ago. Former chairman with connections. Soon to be chairman again, okay. And Braun and Eric from the Bahamas National Trust. This is fantastic, and we really thank you for this presentation. We in the think tank don't have anything to pay you with. We don't have any money, but I think Jeffrey's taking care of lunch today, so everything is good. Sapodilla Estates, Ms. Lane Pinder, thank you very much for these fantastic accommodations. You are an example of what Bahamian success looks like. So when you look at you, we see Bahamian success. Gandhi, as a member of the subcommittee of the think tank, we want to thank you for everything that you've done electronically and otherwise. You and Jeffrey, I don't understand what's going on, but we saw Andy Ingram on the screen, so that I think we've been successful. Chester's still here, or he's left? Robots?
He just left,
From the Nassau Guardian, we need some coverage, so I wish, can someone call him and tell him that we thanked him publicly?
He left to go write the story.
Oh, he went, okay, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. To our fellow members of the think tank, you really, you know, it's up to us to make a difference, to move the needle. And therefore, I would say, let's get involved and help each other to help the Bahamas develop the way we want it to develop. At this time, I'd like to call to the podium Pastor Paul Scavala to close this afternoon's luncheon. Pastor.
Let us pray. Father, we thank you for making us stewards of this beautiful country. We ask that you'd help us to embrace the recommendations and thoughts that will help us to be better stewards. Bless this group. May it make an impact, significantly so. And then at the end of the day, we look forward to hearing from you, well done, good and faithful servants, is my prayer in Jesus' name.